Hi, everybody. I'm back to do the third installment of the Beatles Anthology 2025 as seen on Disney Plus. This will be episodes 7, 8, and 9. And I want to tell you, I have some interesting things that I've noticed, especially in 7 and 8, that I want to talk about. And then we'll get to 9, fittingly, number 9, which is the one everybody's been waiting for, myself included. The three Beatles at the time in the 1990s. Paul, George, and Ringo reuniting to work on Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then. Okay, so let me tell you, first thing is to say everything here again looks beautiful, and again, everything is succinct, flows wonderfully. I think 7 and 8 was, in a lot of ways, some of the tightest of them all in these chapters, and went really, really well. First thing I want to note is when Brian Epstein passes away, and of course, the Beatles are seen talking about him in the 60s and also in the 90s. It ends with a montage. The montage was present in the original anthology, and it's a beautiful scene of tribute for Brian where the song You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is played over the clips. Now, back in the original version, the version that they used for You've Got to Hide Your Love Away was the outtake that was featured on Anthology 2. This time, for some reason, they didn't put the outtake. They just used the regular You've Got to Hide Your Love Away released studio version as we know it from the record. Although they did thankfully keep that wonderful montage intact. I think I noticed that more than once in this series where maybe originally, say with, I think I'll Be Back was one of them in an earlier episode where they didn't use the outtake. They used the studio version. I don't know, maybe back in the 90s they were trying to promote the then current volumes 1 and 2 and 3. So maybe they used more outtakes in Anthology originally. Well, that's one thing I noticed. Okay, now when you get to the Magical Mystery Tour segments, which look stunning, by the way, the color is beautiful here, the audio on the whole thing, I say this every chapter, amazing sound, amazing audio, an improvement in every way. Magical Mystery Tour, there's a little bit missing that I kind of remembered from watching Anthology in the old versions in the past. That is, when they're talking about Magical Mystery Tour and the other Beatles, namely George, and I think Ringo also maybe, are saying how Magical Mystery Tour was Paul's idea, which it was, we know, everybody knows that. And it had been originally a segment where Paul says, well, it might have been my idea, and yeah, I think, but I don't know. I don't think I want to take the blame for it, actually, he says. And that was kind of humorous, and I always like that. It's a pity that that bit is snipped out, and a curiosity, too. But I'm happy to say, for any of you out there who are wondering, one Paul McCartney quote that's the best quote he's ever given is indeed still intact. That one where he talks about the White Album, should it be a single or double album? He says, it's great, it's sold, it's the Bloody Beatles White Album, shut up. That's still intact. Whew. Thank heavens for that. Now, speaking of the White Album, some of the sessions footage is in here, a little more than we're used to seeing, I thought. When Yoko's introduced, and also with talking about the White Album, you have Paul in there doing Blackbird on guitar, which looks better than it ever has before, but I'm seeing a little more. I think I'm even seeing clips of John and Yoko that are new to us on the anthology anyway, in the studio. I have a feeling there's going to be more of that stuff, White Album stuff, coming out in the future. Just a hunch. When we get to Get Back, we're into like January 69, they're talking about the Get Back project. Now, because since the last anthology, we got the wonderful Peter Jackson Get Back documentary, we're treated to a lot more Get Back footage that's well put in here. The stuff that was in that long film that we get to beef up the segment about that time in Twickenham Studios and over at Savile Row and everything. I really think that's a really wonderful thing that they were able to do that with. The Get Back segments are now much better. And like, for example, here in the new version, when George leaves, we get a bit of the Yoko Ono jam. Don't freak out, all you Yoko Ono haters. It's just a little bit of it. What's really important is we get to see the scenes with Paul trying to get feedback from his bass guitar playing into the Yoko jam session, and Ringo going crazy on the drums. And I don't remember this being included last time in the anthology, and I don't remember, tell me if I'm wrong, Ringo talking about how he'd never played like that in any other time in his life, but everybody was just basically letting off steam and frustrations because George had left the band. That was interesting. I want to talk about a lot of different clips here. They're just in general. I'm not going to go specifics. There's a lot of different clips here that we haven't seen before. I think there seemed to me anyway in chapters 7 and 8 especially to be more variety and different new things that I don't remember being in the old anthology, audio and video. But I want to talk about the ending of the anthology as it originally was. At the end, you had all the Beatles giving a quote about what it was like. For example, Paul talks about how he's glad that most of the songs were about love and positive things. George also talking about how, the fans gave their screams, but we kind of gave our nervous systems. And finally, the big change that I really liked here, originally as presented, when you see John's quote at the very end, he says, people keep talking about it as if it's the end of the earth. It's only a rock group that split up. It's nothing important. You have all the old records there if you want to reminisce. And that's how they left John's quote. They kind of like threw in a kind of like sarcastic, typical, John Blunt, downer remark, which John was capable of. But here, thankfully, they change it to a more positive thing. I can't recall the exact quote, but it's a quote more about love from John, a more positive ending, so that he can end his take on the Beatles' legacy on a more upbeat swing rather than a downer. Let's talk now briefly about, I hope it's brief, about episode 9, number 9, right? That's the one with the Threetles, and I'm going to call them the Threetles. We're talking, of course, about Paul, George, and Ringo. But even though some of you don't like the name Threetles, and I'm not wild about it either, it's fun. I'm going to do that. I didn't know what to expect from this. I'd heard that there was going to be a lot of stuff we'd already seen, and indeed there is, but I don't mind it all being put together in one place, and I'll tell you what I mean. What I did not appreciate too much here, I got to be honest with you, was some of this reads like a mini anthology recap, if you will, after having watched the whole anthology, because you've got Paul, George, and Ringo as they were in the 1990s, looking back on the whole Beatles history in a way, and you're seeing old clips from the early 60s, 63, 64, up to the 66, 7, 8, 9. They kind of like tell the Beatle history a little bit. Not for a long time, but what I'm waiting for is to see everything they did new in the 90s. So finally we get around to Free as a Bird, and I heard a story that I never heard before. I don't know if any of you have heard. George was telling how it's funny that originally when he had the Traveling Wilburys band and Roy Orbison unexpectedly died, they'd been thinking about putting Elvis in the Traveling Wilburys by getting a tape of Elvis and kind of working him in there. And apparently Elvis's studio was championing this idea. And then for one reason or another, it never came to be. And according to George, I think Yoko might have got a wind of this, and that's when she decided to give Paul the tapes. Well, Paul says that she asked for if you have any tapes of John. And of course, Yoko gave her a few tapes like Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then, I think Grow Old With Me also. And the first thing they worked on was Free as a Bird. Now that's where this really kicks in. You get to see new footage that you've never seen before, not commonly anyway, it's not routine. I certainly haven't seen some of it, of Paul, George, and Ringo, talking. Some of it we've seen, some we haven't, but new footage of them talking, and also, most importantly, working on the song in the studio. They also work on Real Love, the second new Beatles single that they were working on. It's very, very fulfilling and enjoyable to see them together again. Occasionally talking, reminiscing, laughing, having fun, but then again in the studio, working. And that's really the highlight of this. While they do Free as a Bird, and while they do Real Love, you don't really get to see much of Now and Then, because they never completed it. But you do see them starting Now and Then in the 90s and kind of given up on it. And I think Jeff Lynne talks about it and says that, this would have taken so long, and the time necessary to put in here and everybody getting together, it wasn't able to be done. And I think Paul at some point says, well, maybe we'll go back to this one day or something. But they didn't complete Now and Then until 2023. Okay? Now, as I say, everything that we have is pretty much in this also. If you had the DVD set and you had the extras DVD with bonus stuff on it, there was a lot of this reunion in here. They're talking, they're hanging out at George's place, they're in the studio, they're doing Thinking of Linking, and they're doing Blue Moon of Kentucky, they're playing instrumental, they're doing all of this kind of stuff. That's still here. And another thing is the sequence, which is really wonderful, where Paul, George, and Ringo are at a control panel along with George Martin, and George plays a lot of their old songs for them to react to and comment, and they isolate different instruments. That's here too, which was also featured on the old DVD set. But in the extras there were a couple of bits that are not carried over here. We lose two things that to me are very good. One of them is when Tomorrow Never Knows is being played, and at one point during that, Ringo comments on the drummer and says, hey, who is that drummer? That drummer's pretty good, George, to George Martin or something. And I'm paraphrasing and remembering here. George Martin says, I don't know, Ring, but he had to be a great drummer, whoever it was. That's not here anymore. And then there was another funny bit where they're listening to something from Abbey Road. I don't remember if it was Golden Slumbers or something. They're listening to it originally. Again, this is not in this one. They left it out. But originally, they're wondering who's playing bass on it. And none of them know who the bassist was. Paul doesn't know if he played it. George doesn't know if he played it. Or John played it. Nobody knows who played the bass. And it's funny because these guys made the record, right? So at one point, George says, what album is this song on anyway? And Paul says, here you go, folks. George Harrison, World's Beatles Authority. Yeah. And that was a wonderful little fun part. And that's gone. I don't know why they didn't port that over here, but they didn't. But you get 95% or more of what was on the extras disc on DVD here too, along with all the new stuff. So it is really, really enjoyable, well worth watching as a little story on its own, the final segment, number 9 here. Now, as I say, they abandoned Now and Then and didn't finish it until 2023. What I would have liked, we all have our ideas of how we would have liked things to end or what things would have been in or left out. I would have liked this particular version to end with going back to 2023. Can we have a little footage of Paul and Ringo working on Now and Then in 2023, as they looked a couple of years ago, and working on that and releasing that? And maybe even it would have been a good idea to end this whole show on the 2023 Now and Then video that they recreated. I think that would have been the perfect end to the entire series, and really wonderfully sentimental and bittersweet. So that's it. Again, this is well worth watching, this whole series. I've mentioned some pros and cons, but this is very quick, very breezy and tight and easy to watch. I think it's made mostly for newer generations. If you're an older generation fan and a diehard, you still should be able to enjoy it. I don't see why not. Please consider checking it out. Just even if you just watch it on Disney Plus and just rent it for a month and then cancel, because it's really worth seeing the quality enhancement and what they've done for this. While we're losing some stuff, we're gaining other stuff. And now we have 2 versions in a way, probably more than 2 versions, but 2 is enough to begin with. The long one on DVDs, which is overstuffed and overpadded in some cases, although it does have some good performances that are missed. But then we have this one. The question is, as I've said in past videos, which one am I going to stick with? It's really tough to think. Maybe I'll watch the long one year, and then the next year I'll watch the shorter one, and then back and forth and rotate them every year. Let me see what you think.